thank you so much everyone for coming to the inaugural conference of the Global Political Thought project. It's a new project. It's been in existence for less than a year, but I think thanks to the tremendous work that our associates do, and thanks to all the tremendous support from all of you, we have run a very successful seminar series, and now we're having this conference. And thank you for coming to Cambridge from all over the world, actually. And as some of you have went to extraordinary lengths to get here in this perennial stage of getting close to the end of the pandemic, but not really. So thank you so much. And many thanks to all the co-organizers and the people who put this conference together. And we've also received generous support from the South Asia Institute here, from the Harvard Asia Center, from the Government Department, from the Safra Center, as well as from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. So it's only because of their support that we're able to be here today, so thank you so much. A quick note on the logistics before we jump right into the first panel. We do have lunch and pastries and fruits for the chairs, the discussants, and the panelists and the participants. So and they're right out there, and we're going to have lunch also in the Boyston Lounge right next to this room. And then for dinner, we're going to travel together to the Sieges building in the north, so you will not be lost because we'll be there, help you, steer you in that direction. So I'm going to give way to my co-organizer and colleague, Yining, for a statement, and then we will both give way to Tawfiq for the first panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Hansel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We want to apologize for starting a little bit late. We are doing hybrid today, so things are a little bit tricky to get off the ground at the very beginning, but we're getting there. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that we think it's important to acknowledge the centrality of settler colonial violence to the project that we are undertaking. And we would like to begin with a small but I think important gesture. Harvard University resides on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Massachusetts people, whose name was appropriated by this Commonwealth. We pay respect to the Massachusetts elders past and present. We acknowledge the truth of violence perpetuated in the name of this country, and we make a commitment to uncovering that truth. Great. Theo, over to you. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. Well, so this first panel is titled The Bounds of the Political Between the National and the International. And we have three panelists and a discussant today, so I'll introduce them in order. So our first panelist is Omer Topal. He's a PhD candidate in the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University. His research interests include the 19th century Ottoman modernization, social and political history of the Middle East, Arabian Peninsula, and the Persian Gulf. His articles have appeared in British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, Middle Eastern Studies, and Turkish Studies. Our second panelist is Zhang Cheng. He's a graduate student in the Middle Eastern Studies program at Harvard University. His research interests include, but are not limited to, Middle Eastern political history, China-Middle East relations and interactions, China-South Asia relations and historical interactions, contemporary Chinese diplomacy and politics, and Chinese ethnic history. In particular, he studies international socialist movements in the 20th and 21st century, Marxist theory, post-colonial theory, and the political thought of socialism in China, South Asia, and the Middle East. Our third panelist is Chris Chambers. Chris is a doctoral candidate at Yale with interests in the history of political thought and political economy, 20th century continental philosophy, democratic theory, and the role of literature in political theory. His dissertation research currently examines modern conceptions of poverty and the poor and how they relate to the conceptual foundations and practical possibilities of modern democracy. Finally, our chair and discussant is Dr. Amy Alemu. She's a social theorist and historian of political thought, currently a lecturer on social studies at Harvard University. She's currently working on a book project that examines the history of Ethiopian revolutionary thought with attention to the relationships among US-based Ethiopian student activists, anti-imperialism, and the Black Power left in the 1960s and 70s. So I think that the way this is going to work is that each presenter is going to talk for about 15 minutes, introduce their papers, and then Amy is going to offer her comments, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A, and I'll take a list. Unfortunately, I don't know most of you by name, so when it comes to taking questions, I'll probably just have to sort of point and gesture. Kind of bear with me. Apologies. So if you want, maybe Omer, you can start, and then we'll just kind of go down the table.
Hello everyone, and today present my paper, which is titled Ottoman Internationalism. Internationalism emerged as an alternative to the construct of Europe, which aimed to manage inter-imperial rivalries through alliance formation and secret diplomacy. Internationalism has many varieties and is predominant manifestations for liberal and socialist internationalisms during the early 20th century. Liberal internationalism proposed to use constructive politics to settle conflicts between nations, which were the main actors of the international system, regardless of their military power. During and after the First World War, American President Woodrow Wilson championed the leadership of the liberal internationalism. Similarly, following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, socialist internationalism, which was intellectually led by Lenin and materially supported by the Soviets, also had a high popularity. In the literature on internationalism, I believe there are two major problems. First, internationalism is mainly a Western issue. The Eurocentrism of the literature resulted in the portrayal of the non-West only as an adopter of internationalism. And second, when the non-West is brought into the discussion, the focus is set on the post-war context, which in a way expands the global historical literature, but without discussing the origins of these ideas. For instance, internationalism in the Middle East starts with the partition of the Ottoman Empire, creation of the League of Nations, and the mandate system. The literature on internationalism took the Ottoman Empire's demise for granted and construed it as a defunct empire with territories to be apportioned. This teleological approach conceals the Ottoman agency and their contribution to the idea of internationalism. Starting the history of internationalism around the end of the First World War, when the Ottomans' defeat became clear, gave rise to the misleading conclusion that the Ottomans only got involved in internationalism to prevent their territory from an impending partition, or at least to carve a Turkish homeland out of a fallen empire. We know that in the war's aftermath, both the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet self-determination provided new alternatives to overcome Western colonialism. Some Ottoman intellectuals believe that Western internationalism was a mean to curb the victors' ambitions to secure a new nation-state in Anatolia, where the Muslims constituted the majority. Similarly, many leaders of the Turkish nationalist movement seriously talked to become Bolshevik. However, I argue that rather than focusing on the post-war period, we should look at the earlier phase of the war when the Ottomans actively participated in the development of internationalism. In this period, internationalism was not a survival tactic to block the partition of the Turkish homeland, but an assertive policy to create an international system that would guarantee Ottoman political independence and territorial integrity. Internationalism has also had a very important impact on the ideological trends in the empire, and Pan-Islamism was designed to meet Ottoman Empire's international needs. At the same time, the Ottoman intellectuals were aware that the idea of a unitary Muslim state was a utopian fantasy. Therefore, they advocated pan-Islamic cooperation under the Ottoman leadership to avoid the Ottoman state's international isolation and challenge the European hegemony. The Ottoman government's instrumentalization of pan-Islamism during the war, therefore, was not the triumph of the religious radicalism. It was instead a solution to the legitimacy crisis of the Eurocentric international system. The Ottomans addressed the insecurities in the international order and emphasized the self-determining nation-state as the main actor of the international system. Pan-Islamic solidarity was not a tool to create a unitary Muslim state, but a commonwealth of independent and sovereign states. Therefore, it was an internationalist call to recognize the self-determination of Muslims under the foreign rule. Ottoman internationalism can be best read in its relations to non-Ottoman Muslim countries in a similar situation, namely Iran. And I will use Ottoman Empire's Iranian campaign during the war to demonstrate this point. So the Russian Convention of 1907 divided Iran into two halves, northern and southern spheres of influence. The division of Iran into British and Russian spheres of influence naturally alarmed Istanbul because the Russian presence in Iran enhanced Russian influence on Anatolia. Overshadowed by the European powers' massive and direct campaigns, the Iranian campaign has rarely attracted scholarly attention. The thin literature argues that the Ottomans invaded Iran to unify Ottoman and Iranian Turks and to reach out to Central Asian Turkic populations. I reject this idea and claim that the main purpose of the campaign was to secure the Ottoman Empire's eastern borders and eliminate Russian and British presence in Iran. Moreover, embedded in this campaign were principles and concepts usually associated with internationalism, such as political independence, territorial integrity, international cooperation, open diplomacy, and rule by consent. So I will explain them in a minute. Throughout the campaign, the Ottoman military and bureaucratic elites emphasized that their goal was to eliminate Russian presence rather than annexing Iranian territory or overthrowing the government. They stressed that Iran's political independence, territorial integrity, and financial freedom were under threat, and as a friend and neighbor, Ottomans were ready to help. These are not propaganda materials. They were official correspondences between the Ottoman state institutions. So that's why I believe that they reflect the true intention of the bureaucratic elites, because they are just communications between themselves. They are not propaganda materials. So for instance, Tehran embassy said to the Ottoman foreign ministry that our purpose is to ensure Iran's independence and sovereignty by repulsing Russian and British invasions. We will go all out to cleanse the Iranian territory. Similarly, the Ottoman General Staff declared that their intention was to see their Muslim neighbor become a permanently independent and sovereign Islamic government. The Ottoman Grand Vizier dictated that Ottoman soldiers in Iran will be subject to Iranian law, the local administrators will be chosen from among Iranians, the Iranian administrative structure will be kept intact in the areas under Ottoman control, the Ottoman flag would be hoisted only in the Ottoman consulates, and Iranian officials would not be forced to hang the Ottoman flag in their offices. And lastly, customs stations would remain as before, a clear indicator that the Ottomans would respect the existing border. Moreover, 6 Ottoman diplomats came together and created a commission to prepare a roadmap for the Ottoman state. According to their roadmap, the Ottoman government should work to cancel the treaties that impeded Iranian independence, such as the Treaty of Turkmenchai that forced Iran to cede the control of several territories in the North Caucasus to Russia, and the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention. Russian and British troops must be removed from Iran. Capitulations and privileges of British and Russian subjects must be annulled. Measures must be taken to direct Iranian transit through Ottoman territories, and sectarian disputes must be set aside to win Iranian hearts. So this shows us that the debates on Ottoman-Iranian alliance revolved around strategic and pragmatic interests, such as preventing the European encroachment against the sovereignty and the security of the two states. Instead of framing the Ottoman-Iranian alliance as a step towards the formation of a broader Islamic Union, the Ottoman political discourse emphasized cooperation between the two nations who shared common interests and struggled with common problems. Another important aspect of this issue is the territorial integrity of Iran. In the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire undertook the last attempt of expansion. Reinvigorated by the Tanzimat reforms, the Ottoman central state either aimed to reconquer the lost territories or capturing new territories that would enable it to claim equal status on global politics. Yemen, East Arabia, Northwest Iran, the Chad Basin are some examples of the Ottoman expansion attempts. But during the First World War, this policy dramatically changed. The Ottomans promoted Iran's territorial integrity instead of challenging it. Territorial expansion was no longer desirable for the Ottoman statesmen, who preferred an international system of sovereign states within clearly demarcated boundaries. There are many examples that can prove this point, and I want to share one of them with you. Sine, or Sanandaj in modern Iran, is a place in northwestern Iran. The vast majority of the ulama and the merchants in the city sent Tehran telegrams claiming that Iran's neutrality in the war was against Islamic principles because the belligerents had attacked Islam. Moreover, there was no Russian army in this region, there was no Iranian army, and the Ottomans had a high popularity. In fact, a significant number of the residents of the city expressed their intention to be part of the Ottoman state. However, this Ottoman state rejected annexation plans and forbade the army from invading Iranian territories where there were no Russian troops. This is a clear evidence that the Ottomans' main intention was to repulse Russian threat from Iran, not to annex Iranian territory. They are doing this not because they are noble people or they are good neighbors or they develop a sympathy towards the Iranians, but because they believe that an independent and sovereign Iran, a buffer zone between Ottoman Empire and Russia, would serve Ottoman interests better than annexing Iranian territory. Another aspect of the Ottoman internationalism is the internationalization of the Muslim world. In December 1915, the Ottomans initiated negotiations within the Iranian government to set the terms of Ottoman-Iranian relations. The Russian march on Tehran disrupted the negotiations. However, even as a draft, this treaty demonstrates the impact of internationalism on Ottoman foreign policy and diplomatic relations. According to the first provision of this treaty, the Ottoman and Iranian governments agreed to create an alliance to protect the political independence and territorial integrity of Muslim governments and liberate them from the occupation by hostile governments. They also agreed to support Muslims under foreign rule to create regimes of their own preference And both the Ottomans and Iranians agreed to inform each other about the content of any treaties they would sign before ratification. So as you see, international system of independent and sovereign states, self-determination, open diplomacy, they're all important concepts of internationalism, and they were embedded in the Ottoman-Iranian relations in 1915. This is what I mean by saying that we should look at the earlier period of the First World War rather than end of it, because before Wilson or Lenin, actually it was Ottomans that aimed to create these internationalist principles. For instance, when Lenin addressed his first message to the global community as the leader of the Bolsheviks, he expressed his intention to eliminate secret treaties. Similarly, the first point of Wilson's 14th point was to end secret treaties. So before Lenin and Wilson, actually Ottomans aimed to establish open diplomacy as a rule in foreign policy. So this means that both countries envisioned an international system of independent and sovereign states. Rather than unifying or mobilizing Muslims worldwide, they wanted Muslims to create their own states. So let me summarize my arguments in this paper. So basically, I argue that internationalism was not a survival tactic to block the partition of the Turkish homeland, but an assertive policy to create an international system that would guarantee Ottoman independence and territorial integrity. The Ottoman elites, the Ottoman state as a caliphate, did not seek transnational Muslim solidarity, but international cooperation among Muslim states, as they came to view the world as composed of independent states. The Ottomans viewed the sovereign Muslim states, not the Ummah, as the main actors of the international system. Thus, the Ottoman strategy was to nationalize and internationalize the Muslims rather than to unify them. A borderless Muslim world is an imagination of the Orientalists and Islamists who regard the pan-Islamic solidarity and the agency of the caliphate as an alternative to the nation state. However, caliphate was not the alternative or not a challenge to the Westphalian state system. It was the caliphate itself that attempted to nationalize the Ummah. The pan-Islamic discourse of the Ottoman state was grounded more in the concepts of solidarity, sovereignty, self-determination, independence, and territorial integrity than in notions of spiritual sovereignty or religious unity. The purpose of pan-Islamism was not to unify Muslims, but to transform the Muslim lands into the modern state system. The sovereignty and self-determination were not foreign concepts imposed by the Western colonial powers during the Mandate period. They were first introduced by the Ottomans into the Muslim world. The Ottoman foreign policy changed from imperial expansionism to supporting an emergent modern state system. Ottoman leadership envisioned a regional order where independent nation states from Poland to Caucasus formed an extensive buffer zone between Ottoman, Russian, and Iranian empires. And lastly, tracing the history of internationalism in the Middle Eastern context should not start at the end of the First World War, when the Ottomans' defeat became clear, but an earlier period when the Ottomans actively participated in the creation of their own brand of internationalism. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Omer. Shane, would you like to go next?
I just suddenly found out this thing is in French. Like so elegant, isn't it? 在哪放来着？它这下面没有那个点。
能用这个。
Okay.
We provided too much service, not little. You're going online.
Désolé, monsieur. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how the historical memories is shaping the current relationship between China and Korea from a cultural and political sense. So I started with this so-called phenomenon of the cultural war. is that in between the diplomacy and just like from a social and political level at the same time between China and Korea, is that you see that there is this endless so-called cultural war, like debating where the origins of let's say ancient kingdom of Goryeo, like the Chinese say that this is our ancient. One of the ancient countries happened in the land of China, while the Koreans, of course, saying that this is their own historical kingdoms. And also, there's origin on there's a debate on origin of the production method of kimchi. This is actually really mattering to the people. People online, they spend thousands of days debating where kimchi originated from, and also where's the origin from the traditional festivals such as the Duanwu festival. And there's also this dressing issues, this the Chinese Han dress, Hanfu versus the Korean dress, the Hanbok. And if you see it in the photo there, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, if you see in the photo, that's something that they actually make videos and then to have endless debates about. And this the issue of the clothing is actually very important from the history as well, as I'm going to talk about. And also there's this organization, the nationalist organization called the Voluntary Agency Network of Korea. So basically it's a non-government organization that is promoting Korean culture, and what they do is that they find let's say kimchi or Goryeo and those places, and they go to online and say that the Chinese are sort of stealing our culture, this is our own kimchi, and that is getting a lot of support among the Korean youth as well. And one of the things that the current is going is that they're debating where the national affiliation of this anti-colonial poet named Yun Dongju, and basically he was a person that the Chinese label him as Chinese Korean poet because he lived most part of his life in China, but he was born in what we know as modern day South Korea. And also same thing, there was Zhang Cheng, which is a person who composed the anthem of the Chinese Liberation Army. And then he was having a sort of similar situation. And Zhang Cheng, he was the last person who was a 3-star general of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. But he was also born in modern day Guangzhou. So where do they belong to? And this is a really thing that matters to the people. So what I'm trying to look at is that what is the fundamental thing that causing this mass of the so-called cultural war? And I think it's basically caused by the painful transition between the Tianxia worldview into the current Westphalian nation-state worldview imported from Europe. So I start with what is the concept of Tianxia, which is under heaven, which is all underneath the heaven. It's a worldview. It's an idea that every country underneath the heaven that, as we know of, belong to a sort of a similar entity from a very vague sense. And I want to stress that there is no concept of a unitary sovereignty under the Tianxia worldview, because if you look at the ancient Chinese scriptures, and on that point, is that they stress that there is some sort of a kingship existing among all the nations. And what they did, the Tianxia is a very Confucian-centric idea, but not necessarily as we know a Han ethnic Chinese-centric idea. Because what it was talking about is that there's supposed to be a Confucian kingly country named the Central Empire, as we know as Zhongguo, which is the Chinese still call ourselves like that today, but it was a sort of different idea in the ancient time. It's more of a civilizational idea rather than any sort of ethnic idea at all. And so they say that there is this Central Empire in the middle of Tianxia, and then it is established on Confucian values. It's more like a civilizational kingdom, and then they label different ethnicities in their relationship to this type of Confucian thinking. And we're going to look at how this is important. So this thing has tremendously shaped the relationship between the Chinese empires and the Korean kingdoms. As you see, is that So the idea of Joseon, like before that, it was the kingdom of Goryeo was already in sort of like tributary relationship with the ancient, not only the Han Chinese empires, but also the Kitai, the Juchens, the ethnic minority, the empires ruled by the ethnic minority. And later, if you look at since the Ming Dynasty, there was this very like uniquely close relationship between the Chinese Empire and the Ming Empire and the Joseon Kingdom. That according to the verifiable record of the Ming Dynasty and also sort of similar similar historical documents of the Joseon Kingdom of Korea, the name of Joseon was sort of it is an indigenous name, but also seen as entitled by somehow by the Ming Empire, and yeah. So and also there is this quote that people often use for various reasons, some for political factors, is talking about how the ancient Korean king, the Sejong of the Joseon kingdom, he was saying that Zhongguo is like a parent, while my country and Japan was sort of child. And people today, a lot of people misuse this quote today, saying that this means that the Chinese somehow have sovereignty over Korea. That's not what he means. What he was talking about is that he was trying to portray a world of imagination that there is this concept of Zhongguo. And Zhongguo is not necessarily equals to China that we know today. It's like this concept of the civilizational unity or federation named Zhongguo, and the ethnic Han, China, and Korea, they all belong to this same family of Zhongguo. So what he was trying to do is that he was trying to diversify the concept of Zhongguo as a manageable concept that all Confucian kingdoms can claim, and as I will show in the future, it's like they did try to claim the title, and so there was this Confucian-centric idea of Wanhua, which is sort of a civilizational identity. It's like any country, if you are Confucian enough, and which will be shown from your scriptures, clothing style, and hairstyle, things like that, then you can sort of claim this entity into Zhongguo. And intellectuals did a lot of efforts on the diversification of the Zhongguo concept. If you look at this ancient poetry, very well written poetry in Chinese characters, written by the Korean scholar Yi Sung-Yu, and he was talking about there is a distinctive universe different from the Chinese dynasties existing in Korea. So by this sentence, he was sort of drawing a line saying that we are not under the Chinese control at all. But what we are is that we upheld rituals and righteousness, this concept of Li and Yi. And he was saying that all underneath heaven call as Little Zhonghua, which is the sort of Little Zhongguo. And as you will see, there's especially important scholar named Cui Po. He made a trip into Ming Dynasty China, and what he was trying to do is that he was trying to claim sort of subjectivity of the Korean kingdoms as a successor of the Confucian civilization at this moment. He was saying that we should not be seen as a sort of foreign country because we belong to the same intellectual concept of Zhongguo. And then he was saying that so all underneath heaven should be considered as my brothers. And he was saying that my country belongs to the same family with the Celestial Empire. So by doing this, he was trying to basically affiliate himself into an imagined concept of the Zhongguo, and sort of in sort of equal sense, saying that we also have the power to and also have the possibility to interpret what is the concept of Confucian Zhongguo, or Confucian kingly way of ruling, rather than saying that we have very different sovereign nation states as we see it today. And he quoted this very famous poetry written by Xiu Zhuzhong, he was saying that if the Ming Emperor asked you what the affairs in Han like sort of like southern Korea and the southern Korean peninsula as we know today, he says our clothing materials and culture are exactly the same as the Central Empire. And in his article on the subject of Mohuaban is a very interesting thing. It's like a house of admiration of the Confucian culture. That's what the word means. And he was talking about that, again, stressed this idea of Li Zhuozhongfa. And then what we see the most interesting part is that after the collapse of the Ming Dynasty and the conquest of the Manchus, is that the Chinese, the Han Chinese scholars, as we know them, they are sort of lamenting about the fall of Tianxia. They say like this is not the fall of a dynasty, but the fall of the entire worldview. Like our civilization is gone and destroyed by the Manchus, as like the Manchus like sort of stripped their like traditional hairstyle and dressed into okay. Yeah, and then like to make this short is that the Korean scholars at this moment they sort of like claim themselves as the Orthodox Zhonghuang of the region, like where the Orthodox Confucian civilization are where replacing the rule of Han China. And the sort of like theoretical lens that we can understand, help us to understand this so-called cultural war is that, as I talked about in the pre-modern eras, that there was no such a unitary sense of nationalism or like sovereignty, and the people sort of like sharing the same civilizational or losing like sort of very loose civilizational federation. But at this moment is that the traumas of the modern era have caused both China and Korea try to have some sort of to stress on nationalism to revive their ancient glories as they see it. And the ancient glories, you have to have materials for supporting your idea of ancient glory. And what you would get is that you say like, oh, those cultures are ours. And so they took the universal culture of ancient times as sort of like a national thing at this moment. And this thing really like illustrates the failure of like limitation of modern nation-state worldview to explain a lot of ancient things between in ancient East Asia under the idea of the Tianxia system and this concept of Zhongguo. And yeah, like for time's sake, I will sort of end here. And if you have any additional questions, please.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Just me, no presentation. Hopefully, just for my own presence, I can be a little compelling. So, before anything, I want to thank Hansung for the invitation and for allowing me to present this research to you all. I have to admit, maybe you can sort of glean this from my bio, that this work is very orthogonal to what I'm actually doing in my dissertation. It sort of stands alone. But I do think there's something to the paper and to the idea, so hopefully in conversation we can see if that's true. I'll admit that I'll keep my comments pretty brief, and that the paper itself is sort of it's been stalled for a while. But with the time I have, I'll just try to give a sense of what I try to do in the paper, the sort of main takeaways and the context of it, the background, and we can have the conversation there. So the paper is titled Between Anarchy and Empire, Lionel Robbins and the Colonial Dilemmas of International Neoliberalism. And basically my thinking was that Lionel Robbins is a bit of a curious figure, so let me say a little bit more about his background first. He was a member of the Montpellier Society. He was born in 1898. He died sometime in the 80s. If he is known, he's known chiefly as the person responsible for bringing Hayek over to LSE in the 30s. And then he also did write the Statement of Aims for the Montpellier Society. So if you read their thing online, that's Lionel Robbins. But beyond that, he's kind of a footnote in the Burgess book, and of course he plays an important role in Rosenboim's book on globalism. But my sense was that when folks do address Lionel Robbins, they sort of stop with his work with the Montpellier Society and his work also with the Federal Union in the 30s and 40s, rather than sort of look at the longer trajectory of his thought. And so what my paper tries to do is sort of examine what Robinson's later career or later thinking means for that for his earlier thinking. More than anything, I think I was just struck by the fact that Robbins has a number of these sort of histories of liberal thought and a number of writings on liberalism and the international problem. But what we find by the 50s, by 1952 in particular, in his theory of economic policy in English classical political economy, is that whereas in an earlier period, again during his time with the Federal Union in the 40s and 30s and 40s, where he didn't seem to follow whom Rosenblatt would term liberal imperialists. In this earlier moment, he seems to follow folks like Hayek and Wooten in thinking that and having a sort of democratic view of federalism. If you look at this piece from the 50s, what we find is basically this kind of, I would argue, Millian thought from J.S. Mill, that because of the sort of backwardness, supposed backwardness of global South countries, in particular India, there's I suppose less reason to believe that they can sort of adequately join a union project, and so on. So sorry, this is big. And so what I argue is that if you look at this text here, the theory of economic policy, and his later work, what you find is that there seems to be, or Margaret at least, is that it's in his telling of the historical origins of neoliberalism, and specifically his identification of Montpelier Society neoliberalism with John Stuart Mill's project, that seems to at least partially explain why he might have sort of adopted this sort of culturalist perspective, or at least that's the thing I want to argue, or I want to make. I recognize that's a bit odd. It'd be strange to think that simply in virtue of having this historical story, that